January 17, 1945. Hürtgen Forest, Germany. The snow fell in silence. Not the gentle silence of a winter's evening, but the silence that comes after thunder, after artillery has spoken and left the world holding its breath. In a shallow crater carved by American shells, a German soldier lay motionless beneath a camouflage smock stained with pine sap and frozen mud. His rifle, a carabiner 98K with a ZF-41 scope, rested beside him like a loyal dog that had finally fallen asleep. The barrel was cold. His hands were colder. For 3 days he had been a ghost among the fir trees, a marksman with 17 confirmed kills, a name whispered in fear along the American lines. Now his war had ended not with a bullet, but with thirst so profound it had become a kind of madness. He did not hear the Americans approach. Perhaps his ears had surrendered before his body did. But he felt the shadow fall across his face, blocking out the pale winter sun, and he knew that retribution had come. In that moment, as he lay half-buried in snow and his own exhaustion, he prepared himself for what every German soldier had been taught to expect from the enemy. Brutality, vengeance, the swift and merciless justice of men who had seen their brothers torn apart by precisely aimed fire. He had killed their comrades from distances they could not comprehend, from positions they could not see. He had made them afraid to light cigarettes, afraid to stand, afraid to be human. Now it was his turn to be afraid. But the hand that reached down did not hold a pistol. It held a canteen. The winter of 1945 in the Hürtgen Forest was not merely cold. It was a cold that had teeth. American soldiers called it the Death Factory, a 16-mile stretch of dense woodland on the Belgian-German border, where trees exploded into wooden shrapnel under artillery fire, where foxholes filled with freezing water, and where men died as much from exposure as from enemy fire. The forest had been designed by nature to resist human passage, and perfected by German engineers into a killing ground of bunkers, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire. By January, the ground was so frozen that digging graves required explosives. By January, the 78th Infantry Division had already lost more men to trench foot than to gunfire. Into this landscape of frozen suffering, the Wehrmacht had positioned its snipers with surgical precision. These were not the opportunistic riflemen of earlier campaigns, but specialists trained at schools in Grafenwöhr and Derberitz, men who understood ballistics and wind drift, and the precise moment when an enemy soldier's discipline would falter. They wore specially designed smocks that broke up their silhouette, carried logbooks to record distances and conditions, and understood that their value lay not just in the kills they achieved, but in the paralysis they inflicted on entire units. An American company pinned down by a single sniper would consume hours, artillery shells, and morale, all resources the Wehrmacht desperately needed to conserve. The German in the crater had been one of the best. His name was Klaus Vogel, though the Americans who had hunted him knew him only as the ghost of Grid Square Tango-Seven. At 23, he had survived Stalingrad, recovered from wounds received in Normandy, and volunteered for sniper training when his infantry regiment was decimated. He did this not out of ideology. By 1945, few German soldiers still believed in the promises that had been made, but out of something more fundamental: the desire to remain useful, to have purpose in a war that had long since lost its purpose. Each morning, he would move to a new position before dawn, crawl beneath fallen trees or into the crowns of shattered firs and wait. His scope magnified not just distance but time itself. Hours would compress into the single second when a target appeared, when breathing stopped, when the trigger broke clean. But by the third day in his final position, Klaus Vogel was no longer a sniper. He was simply a man dying of thirst. The German soldier's expectation of his fate was not paranoia but education. Since 1943, Wehrmacht training materials had increasingly emphasized the supposed barbarism of Allied forces, particularly the Americans. Frontline newspapers printed accounts: Many fabricated, some exaggerated, a few grimly accurate, of prisoners executed, wounded men finished off, snipers hanged from trees as warnings. The message was clear: capture meant death, perhaps torture first. Fight to the last bullet, then save the last bullet for yourself. This narrative served a dual purpose for the crumbling Reich. It stiffened resistance among soldiers who might otherwise surrender, and it provided psychological preparation for defeat, a way to frame inevitable loss as martyrdom rather than failure. For snipers specifically, the expectation was even darker. They understood that they occupied a special category of hatred. They had killed without being seen, struck without warning, made every moment of exposure a gamble with death. In the moral calculus of combat, where direct fire could be respected as honest violence, the sniper was an assassin. Klaus had heard the stories from the Eastern Front, where Soviet soldiers reserved particular cruelty for captured snipers, and from fellow marksmen in Normandy, where American paratroopers had allegedly bayoneted a German sniper repeatedly before leaving his body displayed on a roadside. Whether these stories were true mattered less than the fact that Klaus believed them. So when the American infantryman knelt beside his crater, Klaus Vogel closed his eyes and waited for the bullet he was certain would come. His mouth was too dry to pray. His hands lacked the strength to resist. In his final moment of consciousness as a free man, he thought of water, not the Rhine or the streams of his childhood, but the simple metal canteen he had lost 2 days earlier when artillery scattered his position. He thought of water and he prepared to die. The canteen that touched his lips was American, Army-issue aluminum, dented and scratched, warm from being carried against a human body. The water inside tasted of metal and chemicals, purification tablets, but to Klaus Vogel, it was the sweetest thing he had ever known. He drank in desperate gulps, water spilling down his chin and freezing in his beard, and only after the third swallow did his mind catch up with the impossibility of what was happening. He opened his eyes and saw not the executioner he expected, but a young man, perhaps 20, with a face still soft enough to suggest he had been someone's son before he became someone's soldier. The American private held the canteen steady, one hand behind Klaus's head to help him drink, the way a father might help a fevered child. "Easy," the American said, though Klaus understood no English. "Easy now." Behind the private stood 3 more soldiers, rifles at the ready but not aimed, their faces showing not hatred but something Klaus could not immediately identify because he had not seen it in so long. It was weariness. The profound, soul-deep exhaustion of men who had been killing and surviving for so long that vengeance required more energy than they possessed. One of them, a sergeant with a week's growth of beard, extended a hand and pulled Klaus from the crater with surprising gentleness. Another picked up the carabiner 98K, worked the bolt to clear the chamber, and examined it with professional interest rather than rage. "Good rifle," the soldier said to no one in particular. "Scope's quality." They gave him a cigarette. Klaus's hand shook too badly to hold it, so the sergeant placed it between his lips and lit it with a Zippo lighter that clicked with mechanical precision. The tobacco was American, sweet, almost aromatic, nothing like the harsh Russian tobacco that had been standard issue in the Wehrmacht for 2 years. Klaus inhaled and coughed and inhaled again, and somewhere in that simple act, his understanding of the war and the enemy and perhaps the world itself began to crack like ice in spring. The question that haunted Klaus Vogel in the prisoner of war camp outside Liege, Belgium, where he spent the next 4 months, was simply, why? Why had they not killed him? Why had they given water to a man who had spent 3 days trying to kill them? He asked other prisoners, men captured in different circumstances from different units, and their experiences painted a pattern he could not reconcile with everything he had been taught. A panzer crewman from the 9th SS Panzer Division described American medics treating his burns even as the battle still raged. An infantryman captured during the Bulge offensive spoke of being given food from American rations. then more food when he admitted he was still hungry. A Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Belgium recounted how his captors had radioed for a doctor when they realized his ejection had injured his back. These were not isolated incidents of mercy. They were standard procedure. The Geneva Convention governed the treatment of prisoners of war, but conventions are merely words until nations choose to honor them. Germany, by 1945, had largely abandoned such niceties, particularly on the Eastern Front, where the war had devolved into mutual extermination. Yet the Americans, the British, the Canadians, they maintained the forms even when the forms required effort, resources, and the suppression of entirely justified rage. They maintained them not because their soldiers were innately more merciful, but because their societies had sent them to war with a different set of instructions. Democracy, for all its contradictions and hypocrisies, contained within it the radical notion that even enemies possessed certain inalienable rights. Klaus began to understand this not through grand revelation, but through the accumulation of small moments. The American guards at the POW camp who learned a few words of German, not to interrogate, but to joke. The Red Cross parcels that arrived with Swiss chocolate and cigarettes, distributed even to enemy soldiers while American families rationed sugar at home. The Protestant chaplain who held services in German for the prisoners, not to convert them, but because he believed that even the enemy's souls required tending. The mess hall where portions were measured to match what American soldiers received, where seconds were permitted, where Klaus Vogel, who had not eaten adequately in 8 months, slowly regained the weight and strength that war had stolen. But it was the cigarette that became his symbol, the object through which he understood the gulf between the world he had left and the world that had captured him. In the Wehrmacht, cigarettes were currency, carefully hoarded, traded for favors, smoked down to the last possible millimeter. They represented scarcity, the careful management of dwindling resources in a nation bleeding to death. American cigarettes, by contrast, came in packs of 20, distributed freely, lit casually, and sometimes discarded half-smoked. They were not currency but kindness, not rationed but shared. The American guards would offer cigarettes without expectation of return, would light them for prisoners whose hands still shook from combat, would sit on the barracks steps in the evening and smoke alongside men who had been trying to kill them weeks earlier. One night in March, as snow gave way to rain and winter finally released its grip on Belgium, Klaus sat on those steps beside a corporal from Ohio who was tasked with guarding the wire. They did not speak. Klaus's English remained minimal, the corporal's German non-existent, but they smoked together in companionable silence, watching the last light fade from the western sky. The corporal offered his pack when Klaus's cigarette burned down, and Klaus took one with a nod of thanks, and in that moment something fundamental shifted. The corporal was not his enemy. Perhaps he had never been. They were simply two men who had survived a war neither had started, sharing tobacco beneath a sky that belonged to neither side. The historical record of prisoner treatment in World War II reveals a stark asymmetry that Klaus Vogel's experience exemplified. According to post-war studies compiled by the U.S. Army's Historical Division, approximately 95% of American and British POWs held by Germany in Western Europe survived captivity. The figure dropped to 57% on the Eastern Front, where ideological warfare erased the conventions. By contrast, German prisoners held by Western allies experienced a survival rate of approximately 98%. The difference was not accidental. It reflected choices made at the highest levels of government and reinforced at every echelon of command. The United States approached prisoner welfare with characteristic American excess. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, German POWs were housed in barracks with heating, provided 3 meals daily totaling 4,000 calories, more than many American civilians received, and given access to education programs, recreational leagues, and even beer on weekends. At Fort Devens in Massachusetts, Captured German officers attended lectures on democracy, not as propaganda but as academic instruction, taught by university professors who had been drafted into the Army's education corps. These programs were not altruism, but strategy, rooted in the belief that demonstrating the superiority of democratic systems would prove more effective than coercion. But the true test of principles comes not in policy but in practice, not in re-echelon camps, but in the immediate aftermath of combat, when rage and grief are fresh. Klaus learned these facts slowly, through conversations in the camp, through observation, through the strange experience of being treated not as subhuman, but merely as defeated. German prisoners worked in American camps, on farms, in forests, repairing roads, but they received wages for this labor, paid in camp script that could purchase items from canteens. They wrote letters home, which were delivered when possible through neutral nations. They received packages. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, and the full horror of Nazi concentration camps was revealed, Klaus expected the treatment of German prisoners to change, to darken into the retribution they had always feared. Instead, American soldiers continued to follow their regulations, continued to provide food and medical care and basic dignity, even as the films from Buchenwald and Dachau were shown in camp movie halls, to ensure prisoners understood what regime they had served. The psychological impact of this treatment was profound and destabilizing. Klaus had gone to war believing in clear moral categories: the Reich defending civilization against barbarism, the Führer protecting the Volk from existential enemies. These beliefs had eroded steadily under the weight of battlefield reality, under the incremental recognition that Germany was losing, that the promises of victory were lies. But even in disillusionment, he had maintained the conviction that all sides were fundamentally the same, that Americans would prove as ruthless as Russians given the opportunity, that might made right everywhere. The cigarette and the water in the Hürtgen Forest destroyed that final assumption. They revealed that choices existed, that systems mattered, that the ideology underpinning a society shaped how its soldiers behaved even in the chaos of combat. Klaus began to understand that American abundance, the endless cigarettes, the full rations, the casual generosity, was not accidental but structural. It flowed from an economic system that valued production over plunder, from a political system that distributed power rather than concentrating it, from a culture that had enshrined certain rights as self-evident and inalienable. The cigarette was not just tobacco. It was proof of concept, a small cylinder of plenty that represented everything the thousand-year Reich had promised and failed to deliver. By the time Klaus Vogel was repatriated to Germany in late 1946, the nation he returned to was unrecognizable. The Reich had been erased, divided, occupied. Cities he had known as cathedrals of industry were landscapes of rubble. The ideology that had sent him to war was now officially criminal, its symbols banned, its leaders hanged or hunted. He returned to a Germany being rebuilt not by Germans, but by the very enemies who had defeated it, and chief among these were the Americans, who had initiated the Marshall Plan and were pouring resources into reconstruction with the same abundance they had displayed in war. Klaus settled in the American sector of occupied Berlin, found work as a translator. His years in the POW camp had finally taught him English, and watched as former enemies became something close to allies. The airlift of 1948, when Soviet forces blockaded Berlin and American planes delivered thousands of tons of food and coal daily, cemented a transformation he had begun to perceive in that crater in the Hürtgen Forest. The Americans were not merely victors but builders, not merely powerful but generous in ways that defied the zero-sum logic of European power politics. He never forgot the canteen. In his small apartment in Berlin, Klaus kept an American military canteen he had purchased from a surplus store, not the original, which had disappeared into the logistics of war, but an identical model. He kept it filled with water on a shelf where he could see it, a personal monument to the moment his war had ended and his education had begun. When friends asked about it, he would tell the story. The cold, the thirst, the expectation of death, the impossible kindness. Some believed him. Others thought he exaggerated, that memory had smoothed the rough edges of experience. But Klaus knew the truth. He had lived it. In the decades that followed, as Germany rebuilt and prospered, as the Federal Republic emerged as a democratic bulwark against communism, Klaus would sometimes reflect on the pattern of history. The nation that had treated its prisoners with humanity had won not just the war but the peace. The ideology that had promised revenge and delivered retribution had collapsed into ash. The society built on abundance and the rule of law had proven more powerful than the society built on scarcity and the rule of force. These were not accidents. These were consequences. The cigarette and the canteen were not merely objects, but arguments, small manifestations of a larger truth about the nature of power and the durability of systems. Totalitarianism, whether fascist or communist, operated on the principle of scarcity, that resources must be hoarded, enemies eliminated, power concentrated in the hands of a visionary few who could see what the masses could not. Democracy, for all its messiness and inefficiency, operated on the principle of abundance, that resources could be shared, enemies converted, power distributed among ordinary people trusted to make reasonable decisions. The war in Europe had been a test of these competing visions, and the result was decisive. The nation that could arm its soldiers with semi-automatic rifles, while enemy troops still carried bolt actions, that could afford to give captured snipers water and cigarettes, that could feed prisoners of war better than its enemies fed their own troops. That nation possessed a structural advantage no amount of courage or ideology could overcome. The Wehrmacht had fought with skill and determination, but it had fought for a system that consumed its own people, that turned production into plunder and governance into annihilation. Such a system could achieve tactical victories, but was always doomed to strategic defeat. Klaus Vogel lived to the age of 83, dying in 2004 in a reunified Germany that bore no resemblance to the nation he had fought for. In his final years, he gave interviews to historians researching the POW experience, and in these conversations he always returned to the same moment, lying in the crater, expecting death, receiving water instead. He described it not as mercy but as revelation, the instant when the propaganda fell away and reality rushed in. The Americans had not spared him because they were soft or weak or sentimental. They had spared him because their system was built on the assumption that human life possessed inherent value, even enemy life, even the life of a sniper who had killed 17 of their comrades. This was not naivete but strength. This was not weakness but confidence. A nation secure in its principles could afford to honor them even in war, especially in war, because those principles were not decorative but foundational. They were the reason the nation was powerful in the first place. The snow falls differently now in the Hürtgen Forest. The trees have grown back, covering the scars, though sometimes hikers stumble upon rusted relics, shell fragments, canteen cups, the corroded mechanisms of rifles buried beneath decades of leaf mold. The forest has become peaceful, a place for recreation, its history marked by small monuments and interpretive signs that attempt to convey in sanitized language what occurred here. Tourists take photographs. Children play in clearings that were once killing grounds. The earth has forgiven what human beings committed upon it. But the memory persists, carried by those who were there and passed down through testimony and record. Klaus Vogel's story, one among millions, yet singular in its details, survives as evidence of something essential about the war and the peace that followed. It survives as a reminder that ideology is tested not in rhetoric but in crisis, not in promises but in practice. The Third Reich promised order, strength, racial purity, national glory. It delivered chaos, defeat, genocide, and rubble. The American democracy promised nothing so grandiose, only that certain truths were self-evident, that certain rights were inalienable, that government derived its power from the consent of the governed. These abstract phrases, mocked by cynics as empty idealism, had concrete consequences. They meant that a private from Ohio would offer water to an enemy sniper in the Hürtgen Forest. They meant that prisoner-of-war camps would be governed by regulations rather than rage. They meant that even in the depths of total war, certain lines would not be crossed, certain principles would be honored, certain mercies extended. Not because such mercies were easy or emotionally satisfying, but because they were right, and because a system built on doing what was right possessed a durability that systems built on doing what was expedient could never match. The cigarette and the canteen were symbols, but they were also simple facts. Tobacco and water, offered freely, shared without calculation. In that simplicity lay a profound complexity, a demonstration that abundance was not merely economic but moral. That strength included the capacity for restraint. That victory required not the annihilation of the enemy but the conversion of the enemy into something else. A former enemy, a defeated enemy, perhaps eventually a friend. This was the lesson Klaus Vogel learned in a frozen crater on a winter afternoon in 1945. This was the lesson Germany learned in the occupation and reconstruction that followed. This was the lesson that echoes still, in a world where the choice between scarcity and abundance, between cruelty and mercy, between the closed fist and the open hand, remains the fundamental challenge of human societies. The war was won by tanks and planes and artillery, by production capacity and strategic genius and millions of individual acts of courage. But it was won, most fundamentally, by the ideas that animated those forces, by the principles that survived even the corrupting pressures of combat. A canteen of water, a pack of cigarettes, a young soldier's hand, extended not in anger but in something approaching compassion.